It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview the owner of OD on Sports podcast, Amy. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Brandon. How about you? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing good. Can you talk about how you knew you wanted to start a sports talk podcast?
So it's interesting because I never thought a podcast was the way I wanted to go, but I always loved talking about sports. I grew up a huge sports fan, and I remember I was working a job I was honestly miserable in, and someone had asked me if you could do anything in the world, forget pay, what would you do? And I was like, talk sports. It's literally my favorite thing to do. Whenever I had a sales job and whenever I would call customers or call people, sports was kind of the way I communicated with people and the way I established relationships and made connections. So something I was good at, I thought. And she said, Annie, people get paid a lot of money to do that. And I said, I know, but I didn't have a career in journalism, and I liked the idea of saying what I wanted to say and not kind of talking about, the mainstream topics, the LeBron stuff, the, Tom Brady kind of topics. And with all due respect, those are great guys, but that's, I wanted to have more free reign to talk what I wanted to talk. And at the time it was 2000, when first I had this idea, it was 2018. And, the podcast space was really starting to blow up and get a little bit more mainstream. So I thought, why not just start it, see what happens. And I knew nothing about it at all. And I kind of took a class, did some research. And after a few months, I was honestly terrified to do it. So I put it on the back burner. But then I ended up leaving the company that I was at. So I was unemployed. And I finally said, you know what? I've got nothing to lose. Why don't I just give it a try, see what happens? If no one listens to it, no one listens to it. Not a big deal. And it's been about a year now, and no looking back. Best decision I've ever made.
That's wonderful. What are some of the topics that you talk about on your podcast?
So that was the other thing about wanting to start my own show was I love all four major professional sports. I love talking about them, any variety of topics, current events, fun rankings or all-time kind of discussions, jersey rankings, everything. And so many people were like, oh, maybe you should choose like a specific niche, like a specific team, a specific city. I said, I don't want to do that. I have opinions on everything. I want to have a space for that. So when so many people are like, oh, what sports do you talk about? I'm like, literally everything and anything I kind of want. So a lot of it's based on like current events. So what's going on in the leagues right now, or, hot storylines, controversial stuff, my reaction to how a team is handling certain situations, really just anything I feel like I have a passionate take on or something I can have a lot of fun with. Like last episode, I talked about the potential of San Jose Sharks forward Evander Kane wanting to fight either of the Paul brothers. And I was like, okay, well, let's break this down a little bit. I don't know I've never seen him box. So I was like, I'm going off of basically nothing about his boxing experience, but he's a hockey player. There's a few similarities in that sport and being able to draw those connections just for fun. So I get a lot of free reign with what I get to talk about because I'm my own boss and no one's pushing something in front of me to speak on. So it's literally anything and everything, but I do listen to a lot of the listeners and what they like to hear about. A lot of them, the one thing I loved about some of my listeners is to them telling me is they say, I'm learning so much from you, which I never thought, that was never a goal when I started a podcast. I was like, oh, this is going to be for sports fans. I don't want to be, how to become a sports fan, what's offsides, what are these penalties? But people, I guess, one of the biggest compliments I got is they said, you're easy to listen to. And I just learned so much. I feel like I can speak educatedly on a topic because of listening to you, which is, like I said, not something I planned or expected, but one of the best compliments I've ever received.
That's wonderful. How did you come up with your name for your podcast?
So my last name's O'Donnell, and a common nickname for me and my four brothers has been OD. Just easy and short. And when I was brainstorming names, and this was months before I launched, my mom actually brought up the name, how about OD on Sports? And I thought about it and I said, oh, I try to be very sensitive to, if something is offensive or triggering. And I know, there's a lot of families have been affected by, ODing on various amounts of, substances. So I was like, maybe that's not the best idea. But after running it by a few people, they said, no, that's not that deep. Like, run with it. It's a good name. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go with it.
That's wonderful. What are some other, have you talked about much about the COVID and how it affects, of course, different seasons?
Absolutely. That's been a huge topic, actually. And people would think, a lot of people said, when all the sports shut down in March, they said, oh, well, you must be pretty low key free. I was like, no, absolutely not. It's kept me very busy. Everything from the NHL's return to play plan, the messy negotiations between the MLB and the MLB Players Association, the NBA bubble restart, and how the NFL is managing COVID, which I think it's no secret. I think they're bottom of the four for me for how they're managing this pandemic. But yeah, it's definitely influenced a lot of topics. And honestly, it will, for at least until there's a vaccine out and we can all proceed back to normal life whenever that is. But it's definitely going to change a lot. It's going to change how the game is played. For the NHL, it's going to change how the entire league is aligned in some of the divisions. So it's going to be a hot topic, and I will not cease talking about COVID-19 for a bit.
Can you talk about some of your segments? For example, I saw that you had a comedy one, where it was the House of the NHL.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Can you talk about some of your segments on your podcast, your comedy segments?
I feel like the only real segment, standalone segment I have is when I have guests on, and I always do a this or that at the very end, because I think that's so fun and you get to learn a lot about a person. And it's, little things like home or away jersey, what's your drink at a game, your favorite sport, what's your walk up song. It's little things like that. They're just fun, and every sports fan has an opinion on. I usually try to do sometimes I'll do roundups kind of a weekend in the NFL, or especially during the playoffs, I'll do that. But then it's just especially when the Astros scandal was going on, especially when certain things that get me really heated, I'll just kind of part the Red Sea and go forth. But then I do have the fun comedy ones. I did a whole thing on the reaction of the potential Mighty Ducks reboot for Disney Plus. And that's something, for one, it's nostalgic, but two, so many people love that series. So you can definitely have fun with a sports podcast where it doesn't necessarily have to be just ESPN, game recaps and, oh, who's the GOAT? You can have so much fun with it. And I feel like a lot of people don't realize that, and they think it has to be rankings. Oh, if I don't know enough about advanced statistics, if I'm not a sabermetrics, aficionado, I really don't have a place. And I was like, no, there's so much leeway you have, and you can do so many things, especially if you love sports.
That's wonderful. Who are some of the people that you have interviewed?
So a few of my favorite interviews have been, I like bringing a lot of other creators, in the podcast space, other podcast hosts, so they can come in and plug their show. I truly believe, creating your network and helping each other get ahead. It's not a competition. It's, someone's success is not any way reflection on how I'm doing. And if anyway, it's paving the way for something I want to do. So I'm never intimidated by having another creator on my show, but I love having different kinds of fans on. My favorite interview had to have been, I interviewed a friend of mine who's now a professional boxer, and boxing is a sport that I don't know a ton about. I'm a boxer myself. I box for fitness, and it's a sport watching. I'm still getting the hang of and learning. I feel like I've come a long way, and preparing for that interview was excruciating. I watched hours of film of him in the past just to make sure I knew what I was talking about. I wanted to be ready to go. But I love, the reason why majority of my guests have been creators is I love having that open dialogue and discussion, especially because if I've listened to their work, I know they're passionate about certain things. I want to bring them on. And if it's a sport that I don't know a lot about, or, that I don't touch on too much, or a certain team, bring them on and reach a whole new area of listeners potentially.
That's wonderful. What are some of your future plans with your podcast?
It's interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think it's very different from where it was a year ago. It changes constantly as I'm kind of moving forward with it. I think a year ago, I would have been like, oh, I want to, do this and then potentially have an ESPN, come in and pick me up. But one of the things, like I said, one of the things that people I think really like about my show and the things I love is that I have no filter. I say what I'm thinking, and I'll say whatever I feel needs to be said. Like I did a whole segment on how the original 6 hockey fans are the worst in hockey, which is a very controversial topic and not something I have ever heard before. But I want the flexibility to be able to say what I want to say. I want to have potentially be my own boss. So I would love to further grow it to where it's something where it's my full-time gig. It's not my full-time right now. I have a few other things all in the sports content creation space, but I would love to grow this podcast to where it gives me enough income to make a living.
What are some things that you didn't know before you started that you know now?
I think, there's a lot. I think as far as, for one, it's a lot of work, especially if you're doing it by yourself. I think you can attest to that. Lots of planning. A lot of people think that turning on a microphone, you just turn on a microphone and go as far when you record a podcast, and it's not the case at all. I don't have a script, but I definitely plan out what I'm going to talk about. And I plan, certain specific touch points I want to talk about. And that shocks a lot of people. They're like, oh, I just assumed you turned on the mic and went. And then they think editing's just easy. I'm like, no, the editing's the most tedious part of it. But you certainly learn a lot doing it yourself. Which is what I've done. Lots of YouTube videos, lots of how-tos there. You do have the flexibility. Luckily enough, there's some talented people where if you do want to have an editor, you can do that. I chose to do it all myself, mostly because I'm cheap. But I think the other thing that I've learned a lot is, I'm trying to think of how to word this, but that I bring something. There's so many sports podcasts out there, but there's none like me. So I've really honed into who I am and just really learned from a lot of people in that regard. Like no sports podcast is alike. I think that's the biggest thing. So even if you see, there's a ton of, like, I'm in the hockey space, I'm pretty heavily involved. There's a ton of Boston Bruins podcasts. There's a ton. But let me tell you, not one is like the other. So, I mean, there's room for everybody. That's I think the biggest thing that I've learned. But you got to own who you are and be confident in yourself and what you bring to the table. That's probably the biggest things I've learned.
What advice would you give upcoming sports talk podcasts looking to get started?
Just go for it. It's scary. It's terrifying. And I cringe thinking about my first episode and the audio and the editing. But the biggest step and the scariest step is starting. So biggest advice, go for it. Do your research, get a nice microphone. That's an investment. It's, a nice microphone ranges from, I think the one I have, the Blue Yeti, is like a little over $100, but you get use out of it. You got to invest in yourself. That's my biggest, as far as equipment goes, big advice. I think the most important thing that I've learned is you're not going to know everything. You're not a know-all. Nobody in this space knows everything. Even the experts, even the suits on TV do not know everything. So be open to learning always. Always be curious. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I mean, I love football, but I'm fairly new in the fantasy football space. And let me tell you, they are some of the fantasy football content community podcasts on Twitter, everything have been so helpful. And if you have a question, no question is a stupid question. So don't be afraid to reach out to somebody who potentially might be an expert or really knowledgeable in a certain topic and ask them. I've never gotten a DM or a message that I've turned my nose at and said, nah, I'm not going to do that. I will always answer if someone has a question. So just really be open to it. And if you get a topic, if you come across something where you don't know, there's no shame in saying, I don't know enough about this topic. Don't pretend like you don't know something, because you'll eventually be exposed. I think you can attest to that as well. It's, just be upfront, always be curious, always be wanting to learn more, do more, grow, be better, be open to positive and some positive feedback and criticism. That comes with it too. But yeah, those are my biggest pieces of advice.
That's wonderful. Where can my listeners find your podcast at on social media along with podcast platforms?
So OD on Sports, you can follow on Instagram at OD on Sports. We're on every podcast platform, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, everything. And yeah.
Thank you again for your interview and best of luck in your future with OD Sports.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram on Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Annie, for your interview and best of luck in OD Sports.
Thanks, Brandon.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.